1929, a cartographer at the United States Navy named Arlington Mallery was studying a map drawn in 1513 by a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis. Mallery was not looking for anything unusual. He was cataloging historical documents. Then he noticed a coastline at the bottom of the map that had no business being there. It matched, with measurable accuracy, the subglacial topography of Antarctica, a continent that would not be officially discovered for another 307 years, and whose true landmass beneath the ice would not be charted until the International Geophysical Year of 1958. The map was not a guess. The map was not symbolic. It was geometrically specific in ways that required either equipment we didn't develop until the mid-20th century, or a source that no longer exists. The Piri Reis map currently sits in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. The document number is Catalog Reference H, 1824. It is drawn on gazelle skin. It measures roughly 86 by 60 centimeters, and somewhere along its southern edge is a coastline that, by the mathematics of spherical trigonometry and cartographic projection, should not be possible in 1513. Here is what we know about Piri Reis as a historical figure. Born around 1470, probably in Gelibolu, modern-day Gallipoli on the western tip of Turkey. He served in the Ottoman Navy, became an admiral, wrote a navigational encyclopedia called the Kitabu Bahriye in 1521, and was executed by the Ottoman court in 1553, at approximately 83 years old, in a political dispute over his conduct in the Persian Gulf. His map from 1513 was rediscovered in the Topkapi Palace in 1929. It had been forgotten in the archives for over 400 years. What Mallery found in that document, and what a series of researchers have been unable to fully explain ever since, begins with a note Piri Reis wrote in his own hand on the surface of the map itself. Piri Reis writes, and this is translated directly from the Ottoman Turkish, that he compiled his map from approximately 20 older source maps. Some of these sources, he specifies, were drawn in the time of Alexander the Great. Others, he says, were captured Portuguese charts taken from Portuguese sailors during naval engagements. He references specifically a map that Christopher Columbus used on his westward voyages, a map that Columbus reportedly obtained, but that has never been located in any archive in Spain, Portugal, or the Americas. The source maps Piri Reis claims to have used, in other words, predate him by centuries or more. He is not claiming to have charted the world himself. He is claiming to have compiled a synthesis of documents that already existed. The western coastline of Africa on the Piri Reis map is accurate to within half a degree. The eastern coastline of South America is measurably correct in latitude and longitude relative to Africa, which means whoever drew the original source charts understood, in some operational way, the longitudinal relationship between continents. Calculating longitude with precision requires either an accurate clock or a mathematical system sophisticated enough to track celestial movement over time. The marine chronometer, the device that finally allowed sailors to determine longitude at sea, was not invented until 1761 by John Harrison. The Piri Reis source maps, if Piri's annotations are accurate, were drawn centuries before Harrison's birth. This is not a minor discrepancy. This is a structural impossibility inside our current model of how geographical knowledge developed. The Antarctic problem is more specific than the longitude problem, and it requires a closer look at the mathematics involved. In 1960, Charles Hapgood, a professor of history and anthropology at Keene State College in New Hampshire, sent his analysis of the Piri Reis map to the cartographic section of the United States Air Force, specifically to Lorenzo Burroughs, a cartographer at the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts. Hapgood asked a simple question. Does this southern coastline on the Piri Reis map correspond to any known landmass when adjusted for cartographic projection errors common to 16th century maps? Burroughs responded in a letter dated July 6, 1960, which has been reproduced in Hapgood's 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. The letter is 8 paragraphs long. Burroughs writes that the Air Force performed a grid analysis, overlaying the Piri Reis southern coastline against known hydrographic charts of Antarctica's subglacial topography, the shape of the continent beneath the ice. His conclusion, in the letter, is that the correlation is remarkable, and that the data suggests the source maps used by Piri Reis depicted Antarctica before it was covered by its current ice sheet. Burroughs is careful in his language. He does not say it is proof. He says the data requires explanation. The ice sheet currently covering Antarctica is estimated by glaciological research, specifically work published in the Journal of Geophysical Research and confirmed by the BedMap 2 project in 2013, to have formed between 34 and 23 million years ago. This creates the first number that does not fit any comfortable narrative. If the ice sheet is millions of years old, no human civilization could have mapped Antarctica ice-free through direct observation, because no anatomically modern human existed millions of years ago. The counter-argument from Hapgood and subsequent researchers focuses not on the continent being ice-free globally, but on whether specific coastal regions, particularly the sections of the Queen Maud Land coast visible on the Piri Reis map, could have been accessible and ice-free during a more recent period. The most recent glaciological data suggests that some coastal regions of Antarctica may have experienced periods of reduced ice coverage during the Holocene, the current geological epoch, which began approximately 11,700 years ago. A 2016 paper published in Nature Geoscience by researchers at the British Antarctic Survey documented evidence of open coastal water along parts of the Antarctic coast during the early Holocene, roughly 9,000 to 11,000 years before present. This does not prove that humans mapped it during that window, but it establishes that the window existed, that there was a period within human prehistory when at least portions of the Antarctic coast were navigable. The argument then shifts to a different problem, the longitudinal accuracy of the map. In 2006, a peer-reviewed paper by Gregory McIntosh, a geographer at Northern Illinois University, published through the University of Chicago Press, argued that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map is not Antarctica at all, that it represents a misplaced, distorted representation of the South American coast, duplicated southward through cartographic error. McIntosh's analysis identified what he calls Terra Incognita traditions in Renaissance cartography, in which mapmakers filled unknown southern spaces with speculative landmasses based on classical Greek theories that a large southern continent must exist to balance the northern landmasses. He argues the accuracy people see is pareidolia, pattern matching onto noise. McIntosh's argument is the current mainstream academic position, but it has a specific weakness that the original researchers identified: the internal geometry of the landmass. The coastline shown on the Piri Reis map includes a feature that matches the Weddell Sea, a deep embayment on the Antarctic coast between the Antarctic Peninsula and the Rhône ice shelf. The Weddell Sea is not a feature that classical Greek Terra Incognita speculation would have generated, because it is geometrically specific and structurally distinct from the rest of the coast. Including it through random extrapolation requires an explanation. The mainstream academic response is that the match is coincidental and within the margin of error for 16th century cartography. The counterposition is that the margin of error required to dismiss the match is larger than the margin of error demonstrated elsewhere in the same map. This is where the numbers become genuinely difficult to resolve. The African coastline on the Piri Reis map demonstrates an error of approximately 0.5 degrees of longitude, roughly 55 kilometers at the equator. If the mapmaker was operating at that level of precision for Africa, a coincidental match for the Weddell Sea would require us to accept that the cartographer was simultaneously precise to half a degree in one hemisphere and imprecise by several hundred kilometers in another. That inconsistency is either evidence of different source maps of different quality, or evidence that the mainstream explanation is incomplete. Most people click away after the first 2 minutes of something like this. You're still reading every number, checking every date. That tells me something about the kind of questions you're willing to sit with. More investigations like this one are coming. And if you want to be there when they surface, subscribing is the only way to make sure you're in the room. This channel was built for people who read the receipts. The source maps Piri Reis describes in his annotations are the central mystery, and this is where the paper trail goes genuinely cold. He names approximately 20 documents. None of them has been located. The archives in Istanbul, in Lisbon, in Seville, and in the Vatican Library, which holds one of the most extensive collections of pre-modern cartographic documents in the world, contain no surviving copies of the charts Piri Reis claims to have compiled. The Columbus map he references, the one Columbus supposedly carried westward, has never surfaced in any collection. The Portuguese charts he describes as war trophies, taken from sailors in naval battles in the early U-1500s, are unverifiable. The Alexander-era sources exist only as a claim written in Ottoman Turkish on a piece of gazelle skin in 1513. The archive goes cold here, and the cold is structural. The problem is not that researchers haven't looked, it is that the 16th century was not kind to documents. The Library of Alexandria had been destroyed centuries earlier. The sack of Constantinople in 1453, 60 years before Piri Reis drew his map, had scattered and destroyed enormous quantities of far Byzantine documents. The Portuguese, who by the early 1500s had the most advanced cartographic intelligence network in the world, maintained strict secrecy around their navigational charts under pain of death. Their archive, the Casa de India in Lisbon, was almost entirely destroyed in the Lisbon earthquake and fire of 1755. What burned in that building, what was lost in that singular disaster on November 1st of that year, remains one of the most significant gaps in the history of geographical knowledge. The records offer no resolution on what the Portuguese knew and when they knew it. What remains is the map itself, the annotations in Piri Reis's hand, and the measurements that different analysts have reached different conclusions about. In 1979, the historian Soucek published a detailed reanalysis of the Piri Reis map in the journal Imago Mundi, the leading peer-reviewed publication in the history of cartography. Soucek argued that Hapgood's projection analysis contained methodological errors, specifically that Hapgood had selected a center point for his cartographic grid that was not demonstrably the one used by the original source mapmakers. This is a legitimate technical objection. Hapgood's response, documented in a revised edition of his book, was that the center point he selected was the one that produced the most geometrically coherent result, which is either sound cartographic reasoning or circular logic, depending on which side of the argument you're already standing on. The honest position, looking at the complete body of research, is that there are two claims being conflated in most discussions of the Piri Reis map. The first claim, that the map demonstrates unusually high accuracy for its era, particularly in the longitudinal relationships between continents, has substantial support in the cartographic literature, including from researchers who reject the Antarctic hypothesis entirely. The second claim, that the southern landmass specifically depicts Antarctica's subglacial topography, is genuinely contested, with credentialed researchers on both sides and no consensus. These two claims are frequently treated as one argument, which makes the entire discussion harder to evaluate than it needs to be. There is a person attached to this map who is almost never mentioned in the discussions about it. His name was Muhyiddin Piri, which is the full name of the man we call Piri Reis. Reis being an honorific meaning admiral, or captain. He was born, by most historical estimates, around 1470 in the town of Gelibolu, on a narrow peninsula jutting into the Dardanelles. He learned navigation from his uncle, Kemal Reis, who was one of the Ottoman Empire's most capable naval commanders. He sailed in Mediterranean campaigns for most of his adult life, against the Venetians, against the Knights of St. John, through waters that had been traveled by sailors for 3,000 years before him. When he sat down in 1513 to compile his map, he was approximately 43 years old. He was drawing on a lifetime at sea and on a collection of documents he had spent decades acquiring. He was not working in a scriptorium or a palace. He was working as an active naval officer. The map he produced was intended, as he states in his annotations, as a gift for Sultan Selim. It was a demonstration of geographical knowledge as a form of power, showing the Sultan the known extent of the world as Piri Reis understood it, compiled from every source he could find. He finished the map, he presented it, and then, as far as the historical record shows, he went back to sea. He served the Ottoman Navy for another 40 years. He commanded fleets in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. He captured Aden in 1548 at the age of approximately 78. He held the position of commander of the Ottoman fleet in Egypt, and then, in 1553, he was executed, beheaded on the order of the Ottoman court, in a dispute about why he had retreated from a naval engagement near Hormuz without engaging the Portuguese fleet. He was in his 80s. He had spent 60 years as a sailor and admiral. The official charge was military failure. The historical record on whether the charge was accurate or political is inconclusive. His map sat in the Topkapi Palace for 16 years before anyone looked at it carefully enough to notice the problem at the bottom. He never knew that the southern edge of his document, a line he presumably copied faithfully from a source he could not verify, would become the subject of a debate that cartographers and historians are still conducting today. Whatever those source maps contained, whatever knowledge was embedded in the documents he compiled, he carried it to his execution and left it on a piece of gazelle skin in a palace archive in Istanbul. Here is something specific that I keep returning to. In his own annotations on the map, Piri Reis describes one of his source maps as having been drawn by Columbus, and he says that Columbus used this map specifically to navigate his first voyage in 1492. If that is accurate, it means Columbus was not sailing into unknown waters by instinct and courage. It means Columbus had a map that showed something on the western side of the Atlantic before he got there. That map has never been found. The Spanish crown, which sponsored Columbus's voyage, would have had every reason to retain it. The archive in Seville, the Archivo General de Indias, which holds the most comprehensive collection of Spanish colonial documents in existence, contains no such chart. Whatever Columbus carried, if Piri Reis's annotation is accurate, it did not survive in any collection that researchers have been able to access. Leave a comment below telling me something specific. The next time you're in a map library, a university geography collection, or even a digital archive, what's the oldest map you've been able to put your hands on, physically or digitally? And when you looked at it, did the coastlines hold where you expected them to? I want to know what other people are finding in the edges of these documents, because the anomalies in the Piri Reis map are not unique. They keep showing up in different forms, in different collections. You might be closer to one of these source documents than you think. The question that remains, and the reason this map continues to generate serious academic attention more than 90 years after Arlington Mallery first noticed the problem, is not whether Piri Reis was a genius or a fraud or a lucky guesser. The question is what was in those 20 source maps he describes. The question is where they came from, who made them, and when. The question is what navigational tradition they represented, and whether that tradition has any surviving artifacts beyond this single gazelle skin document in Istanbul. In 1960, the same year Hapgood was corresponding with the Air Force, a separate analysis was being conducted at Georgetown University by a Jesuit historian named Father Francis Higginbotham. Higginbotham was working on the problem of pre-Columbian cartography, the question of how much geographical knowledge existed in various traditions before the European age of exploration formally began. His work was never published in a form accessible to a general audience. His papers, according to researchers who have tried to locate them, are held in the Georgetown University Library Special Collections. The finding aids describe the collection as approximately 14 linear feet of documents. Whether those documents contain anything relevant to the question of pre-modern Antarctic cartography, the record does not say. No comprehensive analysis of the collection in relation to the Piri Reis controversy has been published. There is also the matter of the Oronteus Phineus map, drawn in 1531, 18 years after the Piri Reis document, which shows a continent at the South Pole with what some researchers have identified as river systems and mountain ranges, consistent with Antarctica's subglacial topography. There is the Mercator map of 1569, which shows a southern continent with a coastline that partially overlaps with Antarctic geography. There is the Buache map of 1737, which depicts Antarctica divided into two land masses separated by a strait, a geographical feature that was not confirmed by modern science until the seismic surveys of the 1950s revealed that Antarctica is indeed two distinct geological formations beneath the ice sheet. These are not isolated anomalies. They form a pattern across 150 years of European cartography, all pointing at something on the southern edge of the world that the standard history of exploration says no European had seen. The standard explanation for all of these maps is the Terra Incognita tradition, the inherited Greek theoretical assumption that a large southern landmass must exist, which led Renaissance cartographers to draw one in speculatively. That explanation accounts for the existence of a southern landmass on these maps. It does not account for the specific geographical details, the river systems, the divided continental structure, the embayment that matches the Weddell Sea, that appeared to encode information beyond what theoretical geometry alone would produce. Somewhere in the archives of Istanbul, in the Topkapi Palace, the map still exists. You can visit it. It is in the museum. The gazelle skin has darkened with age. The red and brown inks that Piri Reis used to draw coastlines and label seas have faded in the centuries since he completed it. The southern edge, the edge that started this entire question, is partially obscured by a crease where the parchment was folded for storage. The fold runs directly across the section of coastline that most closely matches the Antarctic geography below Queen Maud Land. Whatever information was encoded in that section of the map, whatever detail from those 20 lost source charts Piri Reis faithfully copied onto gazelle skin in 1513, is partially hidden by the crease of a fold made by an archivist who had no idea what they were putting away. The archive is still there. The source maps Piri Reis described are not. Somewhere between those two facts is an explanation that cartographic history has not yet fully produced. If you're the kind of person who thinks the first explanation given is rarely the complete one, and the fact that you're still here suggests you might be, the next investigation goes further into the paper trail. Subscribe, because the next document we found is harder to explain than this one.